In 1550, a debate transpired in Spain over the rights to enslave the native peoples in the newly conquered lands, including Mexico, under the Encomienda system. And now, let's better understand with the help of the In Our Time podcast.
Bartolomé de Las Casas. In 1550, at royal command, two sides met in Valladolid, in Spain, to debate the future of slavery in the new Spanish colonies in the Americas. One, following Aristotle, argued that native people were natural slaves who went with the land and should stay slaves. The other argued that others might be slaves, but these were Spanish subjects and should be treated as equals. This defender of Native American rights was Bartolomé de Las Casas, and some say he was one of the first proponents of human rights anywhere. It's tempting to see Las Casas as a hero in the arguments. These arguments resonate with us in ways that the others don't. Las Casas says this is terrible, we cannot put up with this, these are human, these are people. What did he argue? What was his case?
Las Casas argued that these people were civilized and, in his view, very innocent, very open to conversion. He even makes the case that human sacrifice shows how devout they are, that if only you could turn them to Christianity, they would be the most devout people on earth. So he counters the idea that they're uncivilized, but he also is very strongly against the idea that there is any justification for war to impose the faith. He believes that it should be done by peaceful means, and he very strongly denounced the abuses of the conquistadors and of the encomenderos as essentially making a proper conversion impossible. How can you bring people to the love of Christ through violence?
Well, I think there's been multiple attempts to go against the romanticisation of Las Casas in recent years.
Why do you want to pull him down?
He's often associated with instigating the start of black slavery into the Americas, although we can debate this. It's probably not down to Las Casas, but in 1516, when he writes the Remedios, when he's thinking about how could the labour shortage be addressed in the Americas, he suggests that they could introduce black slaves. He then later recants on this.
He recants on that. It's quite important that he recants.
It is important that he recants on it, especially after the debates. He is more polemical against slavery in general. But overall, he's not opposing slavery as an institution, because there are different frameworks for understanding the legitimacy of slavery coming out of the late Middle Ages. So, for example, one could be a slave if they were considered to be a natural slave.
Who would do the considering?
In the case of the black slaves that arrive in the Spanish Empire, effectively the Spanish Empire is able to outsource the moral questioning of that matter to the Portuguese Empire by saying, well, these people have already been enslaved in Africa by the Portuguese. So that's somewhat sidestepping the issue on the case of the Spanish. But the other significant thing to say about the interventions of Las Casas and why they were so problematic is that he was, on the one hand, defending the Amerindians, but he was also romanticising them and essentialising them. And it's argued that in doing so, he actually contributed to the racialisation of the Amerindians by saying, for example, that they were meek and humble in his defence of them. He was creating a certain essentialising depiction of them. And this also played into how the Spanish Empire proceeded in terms of its constructing its own legitimacy by thinking of the Amerindians as a protectorate, those who were too weak to be governed and therefore needed to be governed on their behalf until they were able to graduate from this position. The other important thing that he does is that he creates a kind of moral hierarchy. He says famously, everyone is equal before God, but there's also space for saying that they're not equal politically. And he actually kind of creates a framework described by some as the founder of comparative ethnography, in fact, because he says that there are different group differences between the Amerindians. So, for example, the Chichimecas in the north were more wild, whereas the Taino were seen to be more meek and humble. And this hierarchy creates a framework for how the enslavement of the Amerindians actually plays out.
Do you agree with this characterisation of Las Casas?
I think it's a fairly well-established thing in the historiography, actually, that Las Casas is a complicated figure because he writes so much over his life, and he also changes his views over his life so much that it's very hard to be exactly clear to present him in a monolithic way. He's not a hero. He does suggest introducing slavery. He does legitimate empire. He does think that you should civilize indigenous people. He does treat them as if they are subjects for study who can be racially ranked. But at the same time, he is, I think, a man before his time, a man who is one of the first to suggest that all men are equal before God and that all are capable of civility. He never does take on the question of what happens if you refuse in the end to be converted. Where's the edge of his tolerance for people's civility is an interesting question.
What's the resonance of this argument in the streets of Spain at the time?
It's hard to know how much people are actually talking about this argument, but it's certainly the case that we tend to think of this as a very abstract debate, something that's just happening amongst theologians and politicians and encomenderos as well, who are very keen to get the right result so they can carry on being in charge and imposing their will on indigenous people. But actually, there are thousands of indigenous Americans in Spain at this time, probably tens of thousands. The statistics are very hard to get. Many of them as enslaved people. So I don't think you can divorce this from ongoing debates about how you treat the people that you're next to as well, about how you treat the people, your workers, and the new laws carry on being implemented in Spain. And we see hundreds of Native Americans with the aid of the Spanish crown appealing for their freedom in the 1540s and 1550s. They see these debates happening, these questions, and they say, actually, I am a free person. I should not be enslaved. But I don't think the debates resonate in the streets. I don't think people are chatting about them around the fountain. But I do think that the legal implications have much more of a resonance in Spain than perhaps we give them credit for.
What bearing did this debate have on the new transatlantic slave trade?
Well, I suppose if you look at it objectively, not a lot. Because, in fact, the Encomienda system does survive, more or less. Nothing really changes until we get to about 1800, really, when the empire starts breaking up in the Napoleonic period.
The Encomienda system sort of dies its own death and is replaced by other forms of forced labour service, like the repartimiento. So,
yes, which is another old medieval technique revived. The repartimiento is an allocation of holdings by the crown, and this begins back with the reconquest of southern Spain in the 13th century. Repartimientos are held. And so that's another thing.
The first asiento, so license to introduce black slaves into the Caribbean, was issued in 1518. And actually, new data from the Transatlantic Slave Database shows that there was a higher volume of black slaves into Latin America than previously thought. So this was really starting from at least 1518 to impact on the composition of the labour force. But at the same time, it's crucial to notice that this is not racialised chattel slavery in the same way that we're familiar with from the British Empire. And in fact, there was also substantial free black populations across Latin America in urban centres, especially such as Mexico City, also in Lima. So black people are entering the Spanish Empire, possibly as slaves, but not necessarily always staying as slaves.
I do think it has European implications. I think that the way we're dealing with all these questions in the New World, we must never forget the Old World. That in fact, as far as people in Spain were concerned, the Mediterranean, the Turks, were just as important as anything that happened in America. And there was a lot of link of people and ideas and behaviour between them.
Was there any change in the attitude of the colonists after this meeting? Did they behave better?
I would say there was the mixture pretty much as before. In other words, there were idealists. There were those who had the gospel view as they'd brought it with them from Europe. And those could be friars or they could be priests. And they certainly were still there. And Las Casas was revered in his order evermore. But on the other hand, you do have a situation in which basically the economic interests go on, and it is very much to do with the catastrophic financial situation of the Habsburgs. The famous decline of Spain, insofar as it was one thing, begins certainly by mid-century, about the time of these debates, and goes on until Spain stops being a top-class power.
Is that because they're not getting enough gold?
Well, it's one of the major factors.
It's easy to turn this into a debate as well that's about Spaniards imposing will on indigenous Americans, but actually some of the encomiendas are held by indigenous people. So Moctezuma's daughters and their descendants hold encomiendas, and some of the indigenous cabildos hold encomiendas or want to hold encomiendas. So there are also indigenous people involved in this debate who are sending petitions either because they want to keep holding their encomiendas or more often because they want to contest the encomienda system. You see Las Casas actually speaking as a representative of indigenous communities. It's very easy to deprive indigenous people of any agency in this debate at all, and it just become about the Spanish imposing things on them. But although they're experiencing devastating loss of populations and destruction of communities, they also are fighting to find their own place in these debates.
The significance of this action is that the Spanish crown effectively suspends the licensing of further conquest while this debate takes place. And what this shows is that the Spanish crown is prepared to give time to consider this matter, that it considers this matter to be important. This shows also to people within empire that there's a place for those petitions from across empire that are sent by mulattoes from Mexico City, from black people from Lima, will be heard eventually by empire, even if that doesn't happen all the time because many of these petitions are lost, might not reach the crown. But there's a framework where at least it's established that is important to the way that the empire operates.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.